Jason Voorhees is an icon of horror. A masked terror who's slashed his way through 12 films, countless victims, and an ever-expanding franchise that has grown to include novels, comic books, video games, toys, and more, as what began as a low-budget killer mystery designed to capitalize on the burgeoning slasher subgenre defined by Halloween became a juggernaut. From 1980 to today, Friday the 13th and the many people that have brought it to life have been through ups and downs, moral outrage and fan worship, an endless stream of production, and a legally entangled fallow period. Through it all, I've found the Friday the 13th franchise to be endlessly fascinating, as fun to watch as it is to analyze and learn about. And in this retrospective, I aim to uncover the story behind Friday the 13th, the evolution of an icon of horror, and how Jason Voorhees has both shaped and been shaped by the horror industry around him. Several years ago, I made a video on the many unmade Friday the 13th sequels that were considered but never saw the light of day. While this video will briefly touch on the what-ifs of the Friday series, watch that video for a more in-depth look at what might have happened. Consider it the B-side to this video's A-side. And now, on with the video. 12 films, a barely connected TV series, and many more pieces of a fan-favorite franchise can all be traced back to Sean S. Cunningham and the ambition to capitalize on the recent success of John Carpenter's Halloween. After seeing the success of Carpenter's movie, which was quickly spurring on the rise of the slasher subgenre, Cunningham worked with screenwriter Victor Miller on a script originally titled A Long Night at Camp Blood. But once Cunningham thought of the title Friday the 13th, he immediately put out an ad in Variety before the script was even finished, hoping to stir up excitement and stake his claim on the name before anyone else could. With the script finished in 1979 and the film released on May 9th, 1980, the original Friday the 13th was a micro-budgeted and small-scoped slasher that, while not as well made as the original Halloween, crystallized everything about the slasher subgenre. You know the story by now. Years ago, several Camp Crystal Lake counselors were murdered, causing the campgrounds to shut down for decades. And once a small group of ambitious counselors decides to reopen the camp, they start getting picked off one by one, until only final girl Alice remains, with the killer revealed as Pamela Voorhees, mother to Jason, a young boy who drowned in Crystal Lake while the counselors were drinking and having sex. All the stock characters are here. Final girl, jokester, popular girl, jock, spooky harbinger of doom. These would be locked in with the first entry, the archetype standing in for complexity. The thing about the story in Friday the 13th is that it's so profoundly simple, said Cunningham. I think part of that had to do with the fact that we had very little time to waste on conventional things like character and plot. The relative inexperience of the crew is clear here, with Cunningham relying more on the idea of his movie than the actual execution. Actually, much of this movie plays more like a lazy summer hangout film than a slasher, especially since most of the characters are blissfully unaware of the danger until they're dead. Tom Savini's effects and Harry Manfredini's score carry a lot of the weight here, adding to the scares and payoff you expect from the concept. Also, using the giallo-inspired mystery approach means that our eventual reveal has less weight than it would otherwise, with little setup beforehand. Really, Pamela Voorhees just kind of shows up, briefly lending a helping hand to Alice until she goes all crazy town banana pants. Still, it's got those lazy summer vibes that set much of the series apart from other slashers. And that's key to much of Friday the 13th. These are summer horror stories, with hangout vibes intermingled with the slasher elements. The film was shot in Blairstown and Hope, New Jersey, as well as the off-season Camp Novi Bosco in Hardwick Township. And I think this is really what helps define the original movie's aesthetic. Yes, these are low-budget movies, but the small-town feel and real-world locations work perfectly by providing everything the crew needed. Just add some unwitting victims and a lot of blood, and you've got your horror story. There's something all-American about Crystal Lake, and that includes its haunted past. While some entries are better at recapturing the essence of the original than others, Jason Voorhees and summery Americana are permanently interlinked. To me, the more this is emphasized, the better. And this was at the heart of Victor Miller's original script, with the screenwriter saying, "What I had done was taken mom and pop apple pie and the clean-cut let's have a ball Pepsi generation of these clean-cut kids who were out having fun unfettered from adult restrictions and stood it on its head. And I just knocked them off one by one." Friday the 13th would set off the slasher boom of the early 80s, but while it would predate the hundreds of slashers that would soon follow, It's very much a pastiche. Halloween, with its iconic masked killer and final girl formula, is in full force here, but a giallo perspective of an unseen killer given life through the camera POV is also used, making Friday the 13th a mystery unlike most of its sequels. Brian De Palma's Carrie is also the template for the film's final dream jump scare, which would become a recurring element across the early entries. There's a little bit of Psycho in the relationship between mother and son propelling the killer, just inverted. And George Romero's Dawn of the Dead's transgressive focus on gore from makeup artist Tom Savini gave this micro-budgeted horror movie the shocks it needed. Put together with Harry Manfredini's iconic score, using Betsy Palmer's psychotic to influence its refrain, and Savini's special effects for some of this slasher subgenre's most iconic kills, and you have a film that connected with audiences in ways few people expected. With a budget of $550,000, Paramount Pictures purchased distribution rights for $1.5 million, only for the movie to make more than $39 million, making it the 15th highest grossing movie of the year, the second biggest hit of the summer, and the second highest grossing horror movie of 1980, behind The Shining. The huge profit meant sequels, and Paramount, Cunningham, and a rotating cast and crew would put out 7 more films by the end of the 80s. Like a lot of slashers, the driving philosophy behind the Friday movies is to have an easy-to-sell central hook. Killer picks off people around a campground, an iconic killer, Jason, who fully formed over the course of the first 3 movies, and plenty of sex and violence to keep hungry horror crowds coming back. All done on a low budget that ensured super high profit margins. But unlike most other slasher movies that multiplied like crazy throughout the first half of the 80s, Friday the 13th had an iconography that allowed it to spawn sequel after sequel. Soon, it was Friday that defined what it meant to be a slasher, forcing Halloween to play catch-up with the much more graphic and mean Halloween 2 in 1981, and its sequels that attempted to stay as prolific and profitable as Jason Voorhees' camping excursions. But it's tough to keep your horror feeling fresh, even as Friday the 13th kept audiences coming back by delivering on a reliable and expected premise. The cheap productions and fast turnaround on every Friday sequel meant that the quality, style, and tone of each is highly dependent on the skill and passion of each filmmaker and crew tasked with bringing the next Camp Blood massacre to life. Often, the Friday sequels under Paramount were made with non-union crews and under working titles like Repetition or Birthday Bash, and actors not knowing the movie was part of the franchise until after they were given the final script. And many Friday actors have a strange relationship to the franchise, with some being very happy to be associated and some begrudgingly accepting the fame it brings. Even Betsy Palmer, Mrs. Voorhees in the original, admits to saying, "What a piece of junk," when she first read the script. But the fans loved her. A lot of this shame comes down to how horror has been looked down on by the mainstream for decades, especially slashers from the 80s. Many young directors jump into horror because it's cheap to make and more likely to turn a profit, an easy start to a successful career. And this was partially why Sean Cunningham made Friday the 13th in the first place. And it's the original Friday the 13th that solidified the tropes of the slasher subgenre that had been consolidated by Halloween. While Carpenter's film alluded to them, the intertwining of sex and death, innocence and punishment is made explicit here, as it's the sex and drug use of the camp counselors that propels Mrs. Voorhees' rampage. With Jason taking the mantle of Friday Killer, he also inherits her sex and death drive compulsion. The original's success meant a green light for a sequel, but to make the story of a crazed, avenging mother who was decapitated into a full-fledged franchise, Cunningham and crew needed to bring Jason Voorhees, the young boy whose death kickstarted everything, into the spotlight.
The day you count on for terror is not over.
1981's Friday the 13th Part 2, directed by Steve Miner and written by Ron Kurz, who did an uncredited rewrite on the original, followed the insistence of producer Phil Scuderi to have the young Jason be both alive and the killer, instead of turning the series into an anthology, which was briefly considered. And alongside the soon-to-be icon, Part 2 is the evolution of everything introduced in the original. Miner is not only a stronger director than Cunningham, who would only produce future installments and direct other non-Friday films, but the franchise really snaps into place with not just Jason coming to life, but Miner and Kurz sharpening everything that worked in the original and cutting out all the bagginess that dragged it down. A return to Camp Crystal Lake with Jason now a mythic boogeyman makes this into a spooky campfire story, which is telegraphed by the film's actual spooky campfire story. And the bag-headed Jason is more a backwoods lunatic than an unstoppable creature to fit his new origin. Alongside his methodical stalking of a new group of counselors who are trying to reopen Camp Crystal Lake 5 years after the original, Jason creates an imposing presence when he's actually seen, with a great jump scare reveal here. Add in maybe the best Friday final girl with Ginny, who's smart and intuitive instead of just lucky, and you have an awesome climactic confrontation that has very well done pacing. Just don't ask me to make sense of the ending. Once again, Part 2 would be a big hit. More than $21 million on a $1.25 million budget. Not as big of a multiplier as the original, but why should the studio slow down now? This time, Part 3 would be back with an all-new gimmick. 3D, which is all over this movie.
A new dimension in terror. It will scare you.
Miner would be back to direct, with a script by Martin Katrosser, Carol Watson, and Petru Popescu, now with Jason sporting his iconic hockey mask. The 3D gimmick meant a higher budget and tons of behind-the-scenes problems, as the crew struggled to properly use the new 3D Pix cameras, forcing long setups, many takes, and a focus on shots over performances. It would, however, mean a higher box office, with Part 3 grossing $36.7 million in 1982, the second highest of any Paramount Friday film. But Part 3 is a bit of a come down after Part 2 really locked in on what works. The shortcomings of Part 3 stem from trying to wring the most out of the 3D. So instead of good pacing and editing, we have a lot of forced shots of things going into the camera. Some of those work, like the axe sticking out of Jason's head, the eyeball pop, or the red hot poker. But a lot of others, like popcorn shooting into the camera, are very cheesy, unnecessary, and held on for way too long. Still, they're fun in a silly B-movie sort of way, giving the audience what they paid for and then some. The characters here aren't quite as good as Part 2, but they all fall into your standard slasher ensemble needs, plus a motorcycle gang for a bigger body count. And having new final girl Chris have a traumatic past with Jason helps add some weight to her climactic confrontation. Really, all that slowness that keeps this entry from matching up to Part 2 is dropped in Act 3, as we finally get down to the reasons we're all here. And the big battle between Chris and Jason is really good. A lot of back and forth between a woman finally taking control of her life, and a Jason who's imposing but still vulnerable at this stage. Plus you get that sick disco remix of the theme, which is peak Manfredini score. As a quickly continuing series that nearly produced a new film every year throughout the 80s, the evolution of the franchise also reflects the evolution of horror and the American film industry at the time. 1981 saw the return of Michael Myers for a rival slasher franchise, as well as the debut of Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, a new icon of low-budget DIY horror. 1982 saw John Carpenter's masterpiece The Thing bomb at the box office and become critically reviled, while Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg's Poltergeist embraced family-friendly horror to huge success. 1983 brought back Norman Bates with Psycho 2, which fully embraced the graphic slasher violence that the original helped create decades prior, as David Cronenberg's dual releases of Videodrome and The Dead Zone highlighted the rise of body horror and the oncoming juggernaut of Stephen King movie adaptations. 1984 illustrated the continuing genre crossovers possible in horror, with sci-fi in The Terminator and comedy in Gremlins. But it also highlighted just how worn out the stereotypical slasher had become. Dozens and dozens of cheaply made slashers had shoved their way into theaters in the time between the original Friday and Part 4, with the subgenre dying out as quickly as it had begun. But the new wave of slashers had arrived, with Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street at New Line Cinema. Jason was already becoming outdated. The combination of the slasher genre starting to wane, and producer Frank Mancuso Jr. somewhat resenting the series because of how much the studio looked down on it, led to Part 4 being billed as the end. Of course, announcing that your star slasher will finally die is a good way to keep the box office haul strong.
Jason's reign of terror is over.
And 1984's The Final Chapter is easily one of the best Fridays, one that's often pointed to as a high point. If Part 2 was the original formula done at its best, Part 4 is the original era at its height, taking everything that people want from Friday the 13th and twisting the knife just a little harder. Director Joseph Zito brings some nice visual flair and a real love of people getting thrown through windows that complements the spooky, small location focus here. Instead of another camp massacre, this is essentially a home invasion, with Jason targeting a group of teens and a family, with the former group being your body count fodder and the latter group being your emotional investment. Having a young child, Corey Feldman, doing great work here, be in danger and having his relationship with his older sister be your major character hook adds stakes to the danger created by Jason. And Jason is, of course, the star here. A faster, meaner, smarter Jason with a penchant for cruelty. He seems completely enraged, as opposed to the more methodical creep Jason of Part 3. To help Jason shake off this mortal coil, Savini returned. While he had left the franchise because he wasn't interested in having Jason become a killer when he was designed to be a tragic victim, the chance to kill off his creation was enough to entice him back to the series. And along with him comes some truly masterful effects, the highlight being Jason's long slide down the machete. If there's a weakness here, it's that the second act is just too slow as we spend too much time with the teenage group waiting for Jason to start tearing it up. Of course, it does give us the gift of Crispin Glover dancing his heart out, so I guess I'll call it even. But once Act 3 hits, it's stellar Friday stuff. By the end, Jason is super dead, like ultra mega dead. But the success of the final chapter, $32 million on a $2.6 million budget, meant that even the ashamed Paramount couldn't say no to more entries. But no Paramount Friday would ever get near this level of success again. And so we arrive at the strange, misguided, misanthropic, exploitative A New Beginning in 1985. A movie so slimy you can feel it.
If the memory of Jason still haunts you, you're not alone.
Even if you didn't know what was happening behind the scenes, it's pretty clear watching this movie that Paramount and Friday's producers realized the franchise was too lucrative to kill off after they put Jason in the ground. So what you have is a movie that ties itself up in knots to create an excuse for Jason to be back, and in the meantime get as many kills as it possibly can, topping every movie that came before. And seriously, this movie has more murders than the first 20 minutes of Transformers the movie, with Corey Feldman unable to return aside from a brief dream sequence that was filmed in his backyard. A New Beginning takes place several years later at Pinehurst Halfway House, with teen Tommy traumatized and mute. And after a very annoying and chocolate-loving teen is axed to death, a new Jason arrives. But who could it be? It's the paramedic. We all immediately knew it was this guy, right? Unlike some previous entries, there's very little downtime here, as writer-director Danny Steinman throws new characters onto the screen and does away with them just as quickly. So the movie blazes by without a thought in its head. But it's all counteracted by the MPAA severely cracking down on slasher violence by this time, meaning that there's very little blood and gore to show for all its violence. And even though Steinman, who mostly directed porn before this film, stated that he shot a fucking porno in the woods there, the mandated editing makes this mostly feel like an exploitation film that's been hacked apart. Almost every character is a truly unlikable ass here, except for Final Girl Pam and young Reggie, replicating the dynamic of the final chapter. On the opposite end is the new grown-up Tommy, turned catatonic and barely a character here, aside from hitting a sick FU. Given that A New Beginning is a whodunit in the spirit of the original, having Tommy be a violent, haunted red herring sort of makes sense, but it's a waste of the character, and the reveal of the killer is, of course, a disappointing, obvious reveal. Let's not even try to explain why Roy decided to look like Jason. It's literally just to sell the movie. But the half-hearted commitment to making more Fridays without Jason, and a tease that Tommy would take up the mantle, meant that Friday fans weren't satisfied. The film was, of course, lambasted by critics. But if you can't please your built-in audience, then your franchise is in trouble. And that trouble meant that A New Beginning only made $22 million. Friday the 13th was in danger, and in order to survive, Jason needed to live. The later years of Friday in the 80s saw a continued evolution of horror, with everything from Reanimator and Day of the Dead pushing the envelope of gore in ways that the vilified Friday films could never get away with, to Hellraiser and Child's Play both creating the next horror icons. The 80s is a golden era for horror. But equally important is the moral panic and backlash to horror that happened in the United States at the same time. While the first 4 Friday movies were largely left to showcase blood and gore in ways that loosely fit within the boundaries of the R rating, the MPAA quickly began to crack down on depictions of violence as slashers dominated theaters for years. From the start, Friday the 13th was reviled by critics who saw these films as threatening the moral fiber of America. Noted film critic Gene Siskel, who actually loved the original Halloween, despised the original Friday, calling Cunningham one of the most despicable creatures to ever infest the movie business, and printing the home address of Betsy Palmer so that people could send her letters to tell her off. It's doxing before doxing, and it sucks. Critical lambasting wasn't all. The satanic panic in America during the 80s is the crystallization of the United States' ongoing moral panic that enveloped rock and roll, Dungeons and Dragons, and horror. Evangelical fears took the Manson family murders in the 60s and the rise of the serial killer in the 70s to excuse hateful demonization of so many.
Listen to heavy metal music. The devil will make you kill your mom.
And as the Reagan era of the 80s pushed Christian fundamentalism and a fear of the other, with the AIDS epidemic being worsened by the condemnation of the LGBTQ community, it's no wonder that the transgressiveness of the horror genre was equated to the satanic. And it wasn't just America that was going through moral hysteria. Across the pond, the rise of video nasties in the UK saw the National Viewers and Listeners Association push for a ban on countless films they saw as corrupting the country. Specifically, it was the rise of home video alongside the slasher boom that made these films feel so transgressive. And the British Board of Film Classification began outlawing hundreds of movies. Alongside all this controversy was an apparent huge amount of shame from Paramount Pictures, who were happy to rake in the profits from their 8 Friday movies while typically hiding their association. Paramount's marketing was minimal. When they announced their slates for the year, the typical Friday movie was missing. But money is money. It really wasn't until the end of Jason's time at Paramount that the studio was finally happy to promote their iconic killer, with He's Back, The Man Behind the Mask by Alice Cooper made for Jason Lives, and big ads and an appearance on the Arsenio Hall show used to promote Jason Takes Manhattan. Charged with bringing the cash cow back to life after the poor reception of Part 5, writer-director Tom McLoughlin embraced a Universal Monsters aesthetic, with the slasher brought back with a Frankenstein lightning bolt, and the Georgian shooting location providing some wonderful autumnal spookiness. Now, an undead Jason slashes his way back to Crystal Lake in Jason Lives, with the town renamed Forest Green as residents try to forget and move past his shadow. Only Tommy, who accidentally resurrected his nemesis, and love interest Megan know that Jason is alive, and fight to stop him from reaching the camp, actually in use and filled with children. This is no longer scuzzy voyeurism, but full-fledged classic horror meets modern slasher, with McLoughlin providing some much-needed self-awareness for a franchise whose every beat and scare was already well known by everyone in the audience.
Real dead meat. So, what were you gonna be when you grew up?
As McLoughlin avoids sex for the most part, and with the kills still being extremely limited by censorship, the film depends on the actual filmmaking to work. And Jason Lives actually changes the story structure, with the haunted Tommy now on the hunt for Jason, replacing the typically unaware victims. I could rewatch most Friday the 13th films over and over, but I could rewatch Jason Lives even more because it matches what I want the most out of Jason and his films. An imposing Jason, fun kills, a spooky atmosphere, an arch tone, and characters to root for. This is the best Tommy Jarvis. Jason Lives is a huge change to the series, but still remains true to everything that draws in fans. Still, Jason Lives would make less than A New Beginning. These films would never again make as much as the initial installments, even as the concurrent Nightmare on Elm Street films would top out at $50 million. And so it was around this time that Sean S. Cunningham would push for his slasher icon to cross over with another, Freddy Krueger, and thus begins a very long saga of trying to get these two to meet. Cunningham and Paramount would try to get New Line to agree to a crossover, but the studios didn't see eye to eye over distribution. And after several pitches for Part 7, Paramount settled on The New Blood, which was essentially pitched as Jason vs. Carrie.
Jason is back. But this time, someone is waiting.
7 films into the franchise, and it's safe to say that the Friday the 13th formula was running dry, well past the slasher heyday and any sense of reality necessary to make these films scary. But I really like The New Blood. Final girl Tina having psychic and telekinetic abilities is an even further step removed from the early entries. But at this point, Jason is a bloodthirsty revenant, so why hold back? Giving Tina a tragic backstory enhanced by accidentally resurrecting Jason gives her some dimension as a character which, of course, no one else here has. Adding in a terrible psychologist trying to profit from her misery adds a villain to the mix, as Jason goes on the hunt early on, livening up the pace. And I dig those lakeside vacation home vibes. Although the film is filled with kills throughout, this is probably the tamest film in terms of violence. Something like Jason killing the psychologist with a pole chainsaw is brutal in theory, but is edited down by censors to only suggest what happened. But I really enjoy that final battle, with Tina letting her powers rip as she does everything to take out the unstoppable Jason. It does, however, end in the silliest way imaginable, with Zombie Dad dragging Jason back into the lake, looking surprisingly good for having been underwater for a decade. Also, this is the point in the series where we've stopped paying attention to the timeline, so just go with it. Fun fact, Mancuso Jr. and screenwriter Daryl Haney believed that The New Blood should win an Oscar, and pushed for French New Wave director Francois Truffaut to direct the film. As you've already guessed, The New Blood made even less money than the last. Still, there was enough profit to greenlight another, this time approving 2 concepts from writer-director Rob Hedden, Jason on a cruise ship and Jason in New York, forcing him to combine the two in a cost-saving maneuver that limited the time in the Big Apple. The result, Jason Takes Manhattan, is the final outing for Jason in the 80s, and the patron saint of movies that failed to live up to their premise. Even if you've never seen it, you probably know that Jason Takes Manhattan barely has any time in New York, and what takes place there is almost entirely shot elsewhere. And on this 8th revisit to the Friday formula, the franchise finally completely gives out. And really, the worst thing about this film is that it's boring. The characters are lifeless, the kills are cut down to nothing, and even the 80s vibes are missing for the most part beyond a great cheesy opening and closing song, The Darkest Side of the Night. Probably my favorite thing about the movie. Aside from that I Love New York poster. The second worst thing is how absolutely confused this movie is about the Jason mythology. And while each film has been pretty flexible about the powers and history of its central figure, this is so weird. Visions of Kid Jason, a flashback encounter with a lake-dwelling young ghost, and a toxic waste bath that releases the inner child to just hang out in Manhattan sewers for the rest of his life? I don't understand. Also, let's not forget a horrendous, hilarious car crash involving a vision of young Jason. Just bottom of the barrel stuff. The budget limitations really show here as we bide our time on a cruise ship that somehow goes from Crystal Lake in New Jersey to Manhattan. And if this had mostly taken place in the cartoonish hellscape that is this film's vision of New York, it might have been fun in a satirical, strange way. Instead, we get a movie that's too long and too empty to make an impact. Jason Takes Manhattan would only make $14 million on a $5 million budget. Not nearly enough for Paramount to continue justifying non-stop entries into the franchise, and a slow, disappointing death for the original era of Friday the 13th. However, Cunningham's continued efforts to get a Freddy crossover led to Paramount licensing the rights to the character of Jason Voorhees to New Line Cinema, but specifically, it was Jason himself that was licensed, not the Friday the 13th title, which is why every New Line entry uses Jason in the title and not Friday the 13th. But much like the previous few years, New Line would put the crossover on hold, resulting in Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday in 1993, and Jason X in 2002. And both showcase not only how far the franchise has gone since those first fateful days at Camp Crystal Lake, but how much the concept has been wrung dry. Put bluntly, Friday the 13th should have never left the 80s.
But pure evil wears only one And this is your final chance to see it.
Much like the final chapter, Jason Goes to Hell is sold on the promise of killing off its central character. Strange move for a studio that just bought the guy. At this point, the slasher craze and the slasher resurgence were over, and we were still a few years away from the post-Scream 90s slasher boom. So Jason didn't really have any cachet. Maybe promising the end of an overexposed character might help. And the opening is a fantastic, subversive start, with the main man blown to pieces in a sting operation. But it all goes downhill from there. Evil worm-possessed killers are just not interesting, and regular Jason literally looks like a pile of shit. When you find out that the entire script was thrown out and rewritten in 4 days, it makes sense. I will say that the effects here are a huge step up from the past few Fridays, as Al Magliochetti and effects studio K&B get more room to strut their stuff in the new decade. The melting body getting its jaw stuck to the floor is top-tier body horror, and can really only happen in this ill-advised story. So those aspects, combined with a good opening, a strong Evil Dead-influenced finale, Jason is a deadite here, along with an extremely convoluted and bad magical background, and some good characters like the badass and strange Creighton Duke, are the positives that even out the rest. And to sell audiences on the crossover, Jason Goes to Hell ends with Jason's mask pulled down by Freddy's clawed hand. The continued delays for the crossover, with dozens of scripts pitched, written, and thrown out, led to Cunningham greenlighting another Jason movie to keep his slasher in the public consciousness. And so here comes Jason X.
In the year 2455, on a routine training mission, a team of students is about to discover a life form frozen in time.
Jason in the future, cryogenically frozen and woken further in the future and in space, and then turned into the cyborg Uber Jason. I think there's two ways you can look at this movie. This is either so far beyond where the franchise should have ended that you can't stand it, or it's such a wild and ridiculous take that you just go with it. For me, I mostly go with it, because how can you really hold anything sacred with Friday the 13th by the 10th installment? Putting Jason in space and in the future is at least a bigger and stranger swing. Every installment post 5 ups the weird additions to the F-13 formula, and this is easily the most ridiculous. Of course, putting this franchise in an inherently expensive setting doesn't help the look of Jason X. You can get away with small budgets when you're in the forest and using pre-existing campgrounds and homes, so this ends up looking like a Saturday afternoon syndicated sci-fi show. There's a certain charm to that, but you can only show me low-lit metal beams and tell me it's the future so many times. And in 2003, Freddy vs. Jason was finally brought to the big screen. Directed by Ronnie Yu with a script written by Damian Shannon and Mark Swift. This Slash of the Titans builds off several proposed concepts, but the story is simple. Freddy is long forgotten and powerless, so he resurrects Jason to terrorize his stomping grounds of Springwood, Ohio, so that the residents' resurgent fear and belief in Krueger will bring him back. Cue a group of teens trying to stop the pair and a climactic fight between the two. When rewatched in the context of the entire Friday the 13th series, this crossover finale feels like such a strange outlier. Simply put, having Jason and Freddy on a rampage in a full-bore 2000s extremely blue-tinted post-grunge rock scored teenage wasteland doesn't really work. Part of the appeal of the Friday films is that there's a certain old-school charm to them that is rooted in the 80s, which helps make even the lesser entries still entertaining. Ronnie used direction and a script that's trying to balance the two franchises without really leaning into either strengths is also to blame. And of course, we're all here to watch the two icons of horror fight, which doesn't happen until the final act. When it does, it's fun and outlandish in a way that almost feels like a precursor to most superhero movie fights years later. But until then, we're stuck with some bad characters spouting some really bad dialogue. Also, Jason isn't afraid of water. What a strange addition for a character that likes to hang out in a lake. This was, of course, decades in the making and was a big event, so it did really well at the box office, scoring $116 million on a $30 million budget, way more than any single Friday or Nightmare film. But I think the general underwhelming end product doesn't have much legs beyond the essential appeal of Freddy and Jason sharing the screen. So it's no wonder why they couldn't get a sequel going, even if it would have been fun to see a proposed sequel with Evil Dead's Ash Williams carving them both up. And with the crossover sequel never realized, this would be the end of Jason Voorhees. A grand finale, even if its delays meant that the franchise had truly run out of gas already. But just as the franchise went dormant, a new trend in horror began: the big-budget horror remake. The Ring in 2002, Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003, Dawn of the Dead in 2004. Lots of classic horror was getting an update for the 2000s, and the box offices were big. So New Line Cinema, Michael Bay's Platinum Dunes, Paramount, and Cunningham worked together to give Friday the remake treatment, this time using anything they wanted, including the title. And the result is the 2009 reboot directed by Marcus Nispel, who'd also done the Chainsaw remake. While this new vision restarts Jason's saga, it's actually a hodgepodge of the first 4 movies, using Pamela in the prologue, bag-headed Jason adopting the hockey mask, and a home invasion in the style of the final chapter, with a brother searching for his kidnapped sister. This new edition is very much a reflection of its time and the streak of viciousness that had entered popular horror in the new millennium through films like Saw and Hostel. Having a smarter, faster, more hunter-like Jason is a cool new take. But there's something about this movie that just isn't fun. A lot like Platinum Dune's Chainsaw remake and later Nightmare remake, this new Friday is mean, dirty, and well, kinda ugly looking. But even with a $19 million budget, it was a big success, grossing $92 million. Everything in horror is cyclical, and it was clear that the mainstream appetite for Friday the 13th had returned bigger than ever. And with a seemingly dead Jason returning for one final jump scare, the stage was set for more movies. However, the 2008 recession stalled sequel efforts and forced another change in production rights. And while many different scripts for a new movie were pitched, it was original film writer Victor Miller who stopped Jason for good. In 2016, Miller sued to be the rightful owner of the Friday characters under US copyright law, which allows the original author of a work to regain the rights after 35 years. The lawsuit froze anything in production, including the recent video game, which was appealed by Cunningham in 2018. But while Cunningham argued it was a work for hire, a judge officially ruled at the end of 2021 that Miller had the rights to the franchise. What will happen to Jason Voorhees? Will there be another reboot to capitalize on the new wave of slasher mania spearheaded by the new Halloween and Scream entries? Will continued appeals keep Friday in limbo even longer? At this moment, it's unclear. But one thing is certain: the love for Friday the 13th is stronger than ever, with devotees keeping Jason alive through popular fan films like the Never Hike Alone series. But when talking about the evolution of the Friday the 13th franchise, you have to talk about the ever-evolving look of Jason Voorhees himself. Besides the nightmare version in the original, Jason has always been a mysterious, hulking beast of a man who hides his face. In his first starring role, Jason was the most human he would ever be, more of a backwoods survivalist with a mind set on revenge than an unstoppable force. This is Jason by the way of The Town That Dreaded Sundown and The Elephant Man, with his sackhead mask and a denim and flannel outfit that looks like something I would have worn around 2010. And this is the most nimble Jason we'd ever have until the reboot. More vulnerable, faster, big but not huge, and like everyone has, a shrine to his mother's head. As each film went on, with Jason coming back from his seeming death over and over, he naturally moved further and further away from humanity. It was part 3 where the Jason everyone knows was fully developed, with the classic hockey mask being the key ingredient, taken from a victim and decided by the crew on the fly. Chopped in the neck in part 2, axed in the head in part 3, Jason slowly piled up the injuries until being hacked apart by young Tommy Jarvis. And aside from a quick detour into Roy Burns, I think the blue chevrons on the mask actually look pretty good. Jason's resurrection in part 6 would bring an end to the human era and turn him into an undead juggernaut. Along the way, little changes to Jason's attire would be made. Long shirts, jumpsuits, jackets, coveralls. The attire isn't as important as the mask or the machete. Jason is a working man, and killing is his business. Along the way, Jason was brought to life by 8 different actors. Ari Lehman in Friday the 13th, Warrington Gillette in Part 2, Richard Brooker in Part 3, Ted White in the final chapter, CJ Graham in Jason Lives, Kane Hodder in New Blood, Jason Takes Manhattan, Jason Goes to Hell, and Jason X, Ken Kersinger in Freddy vs. Jason, and Derek Mears in the reboot. While everyone will have their favorite Jason, Hodder is, of course, most closely associated with the role. Not only did Hodder have the most outings, but he brings the most personality to the character, with the added benefit of the films no longer needing to hide their character for the sake of mystery. Hodder's Jason is constantly in full frame, and alongside the camera time is a truly angry, hulking, heavy-breathing, brutal force of nature. Far more emotional than the versions that came before. It's just a shame that Hodder's time behind the mask coincides with a major dip in franchise quality. But the only thing about Jason that changed more than the man behind the mask is the face hidden behind it. To coincide with the mystery of what the mask might hide, almost every movie features a brief unmasking of Jason, unveiling some sort of horror. This, unfortunately, plays into the common trope in horror that a physical deformity means a person is evil. But Jason is also beloved by fans. He's the true star of the franchise. People don't love to hate him or love to watch him die, they just love him. When I was young and hadn't seen the films, Jason was fascinating to me, at once terrifying and fun. Pre-death Jason goes from hairy, deformed mountain man to bald creep to what can only be described as Squidward hit by a bus. Post-death, Jason is a full-on zombie, covered in maggots during his resurrection, an angry skeleton in new blood, whatever waterlogged crap this is, to a pussy turd. Why does Jason look so different in each? How did he survive that drowning in the first place? What year is this? I don't think continuity is the Friday franchise's focus beyond a little bit of connective tissue, so don't worry about it. And as I do with every retrospective, here's my ranking of every Friday the 13th film, from worst to best. At 12, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Disappointing, slow, and lacking in any tension or even humor to make up for it, this is a slog all the way through, and way too long. Still, even the worst Friday movie can be fun, and I think this franchise has a steadier level of enjoyment than the Halloween, Nightmare, or Hellraiser franchises. Best kill goes to Julius, who gets his head knocked off with a single punch after getting rope-a-dope by Jason. The single scene in this movie that feels like the creators knew what they were doing. At 11, Freddy vs. Jason. I've never really been a fan of Freddy vs. Jason because of its early 2000s aesthetic and tone, which is just kinda bad vibes personified. Really, the most enjoyable part is the battle between Freddy and Jason, but I don't want to sit through the rest of the movie to get to it. Best kill goes to Trey, turned into a pincushion and folded like laundry by Jason in the first and best instance in the film. Like the rest of the movie, it's overblown, super violent, and edited to within an inch of its life. But the inventiveness makes it still work. At 10, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. This is not a poorly made movie, and the gothic serial killer tones here work pretty well, but the fact that Jason is possessing people and all the strange mythology added in just don't work. Fun fact, the cover to this movie used to scare the hell out of me when roaming the aisles of Blockbuster. Maybe if little Matt had actually watched the movie, he wouldn't have cared. Best kill goes to Jason himself. Riddled with bullets like Sonny Corleone and blown up good in a great opening to a movie that has to deal with the fallout of going in a new direction. At 9, Jason X. Corny and silly, but also very self-aware, just not all that well executed. Also, Uber Jason doesn't arrive until more than an hour into the movie. I think that with more Uber Jason, more ridiculousness, and probably a few $1 million more in the budget, this could be more than a guilty pleasure and actually be stronger. That second act is pretty weak, as Jason kinda just does his usual thing but in a poorly made spaceship set, and with quite a few kills off screen. Best kill goes to the science lady in the liquid nitrogen, showing that there's still some inventiveness left in this franchise. I just wish that more of this movie let its kills and action be as wild as this. At 8, Friday the 13th, the remake. Friday the 13th should have stayed in the 80s, and when they decided to reboot, they should have set it in the 80s. There's just something totally off about Jason in the 2000s that strips the franchise of any sort of style and charm. Sure, the kills are well executed and the atmosphere is tense, but there's no real sense of fun here. Instead, it's replaced by a grim self-seriousness that offsets any sort of technical prowess. These movies are popular because they're a good time, and that just doesn't quite happen here. Best kill goes to Jenna, impaled with a machete in one of the franchise's more shocking deaths. At 7, Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. 1985's A New Beginning, aka Roy the Movie, is trash in ways that no other Friday film would ever be, but it's still very entertaining trash. And while you rarely root for any of these characters or even really know them, the pacing and meaner tone set this one apart. Truly a movie for dang-ass freaks. Best kill goes to Demon in the Metal Outhouse, getting the 1-2 punch of those damn enchiladas and then getting skewered. P.S. Ooh Baby is a banger. Would have topped the charts if given the chance. At 6, Friday the 13th. By horror standards, Friday the 13th is lacking in a lot of areas, but it's a quintessential early slasher that knows exactly how to use the formula and has quite a few iconic moments. The early chase through the woods, the arrow kill, the final death, and the last scare are all classic, but it's the downtime between them that drags the movie down. And when compared to how quickly the series would level up and find its voice with part 2, the original Friday is a bit of a drag. Best kill goes to, of course, Kevin Bacon's arrow death. But Pamela's slow-motion neck grasping is a close second thanks to Tassos Stavrakis' hairy knuckles. At 5, Friday the 13th Part 3. Part 3 is filled with iconic moments that help elevate it past the bad pacing and silly 3D shots. And while most of the movie revolves around people constantly going into Jason's barn and getting hacked apart, it still works. Like I said before, the final battle between Chris and Jason is a strong third act. Best kill goes to Jason's skull-crushing finale on Rick, using a great 3D gag that still works in regular 2D. At 4, Friday the 13th Part 7. The New Blood. Like I said, I really like the central conceit here of fake Carrie versus Jason, and while the characters and kills might not be very strong, the fight between the two central figures elevates the film. It also might have my favorite Jason design, with all those years under the lake rotting our favorite guy away for a great face reveal. Best kill goes to Judy in the sleeping bag, bashed against a tree in one of the franchise's most iconic moments. And while censorship trimmed this down to a single hit, its brevity and efficiency are what make it so perfect. At 3, Friday the 13th Part 2. I think Part 2 is an excellent example of a straightforward slasher, and its tension, kills, and structure work really well. Savini may be gone, but the kills and effects are top-notch here. Plus, Miner plays with voyeuristic camera work, making you constantly unsure if you're looking through Jason's eyes or just the cinematographer's, adding to the suspense. And really, this is an extremely entertaining movie, even as Proto-Jason is still a step away from becoming a complete horror icon. Best kill goes to Mark, getting a machete in the face from the least expected angle, and going for a long ride. Also, RIP Crazy Ralph, gone too soon. At 2, Part 4, The Final Chapter. The Final Chapter is, of course, iconic within this franchise and the horror genre in general, and that's thanks to its lean focus and Savini's work on both the kills and Jason himself. I also really like the Jarvis family. Would-be Jason hunter Rob getting taken out like a chump, and Tommy's attack on Jason are so great, with just enough menace at the end to let the psychological repercussions linger, which will mostly be bungled in A New Beginning. Best kill goes to Crispin Glover asking for a corkscrew and getting it, along with a cleaver in a fast but brutal attack. The returning Tom Savini really strutting his stuff here. And at 1, Part 6, Jason Lives. Jason Lives is one of my favorite horror movies, full stop. Not just Friday the 13th or slasher movies. The balance of horror and comedy, the scares, the effects, the kills, and most of all, the atmosphere. They're all brilliant here. I mean, this thing honks. On its own, it holds up extremely well without the need for the audience to buy into the expectations of the franchise. But seen within the scope of the larger series, Friday the 13th Part 6 feels extremely fresh and reinvigorating. Best kill goes to Horshack getting his heart punched through by Zombie Jason, fully announcing that the new era of Undead Jason has arrived. To me, the Friday the 13th franchise is the story of a movie series that capitalized early on a subgenre, quickly capturing the zeitgeist for success, and creating an iconic character that transcended the genre. Everyone knows Jason Voorhees, and everyone knows what a Friday the 13th film means. And while Jason may lie dormant, waiting for the chance to rise from the dead and strike again, there will be millions waiting for him when he does. Thanks for watching today's video, my longest video ever. And who would have guessed that it would have been Jason Voorhees who inspired it? As I mentioned before, I've covered the Friday the 13th franchise in an Unmade Sequels video, and I've touched on it here and there in a lot of different videos covering horror over the years. And a lot of those videos can work in conjunction with this retrospective as a larger scope view of horror in general. And really, I love digging into all aspects of the horror genre. And together, I think they make a larger and larger mosaic of what horror means throughout the decades. So if you enjoyed this video, you can watch a lot of different videos on a lot of the different movies that have been touched on here briefly. Obviously, I'm a fan of the Friday the 13th franchise, but I can very much see its shortcomings and its strengths at the same time. There can be a lot of criticisms leveled at a lot of these movies, but I think that the Friday franchise is one of the most consistently fun horror franchises. Not all of these are masterpieces, but almost all of them are a good time. As I mentioned, Jason Lives is one of my favorite horror movies in general, and if you'd like my more in-depth thoughts on that movie, I did a Patreon exclusive review of Jason Lives last year around Halloween, and I talked about it for about 30 minutes. I would love to hear your own personal rankings of the Friday movies, your thoughts on this franchise in general, how you think it stacks up to other contemporary franchises like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, and even Hellraiser and Child's Play, and your favorite incarnation of Jason Voorhees himself. There's just so much to talk about when it comes to Friday the 13th. So hit me with all your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access and exclusive Patreon-only audio reviews. At the time of this video's publication, there should be a review of Spider-Man No Way Home, which I didn't see in the theaters. Until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and looking out for one another. See you again soon.